Welcome to the Climate Economics Podcast with me, your host, Advait Viana. And today we're focusing on air pollution, an issue not just related to climate change, but deeply intertwined with it, because both are driven largely by fossil fuel combustion. So progress on one often helps the other. But air pollution is more than just a climate co-benefit. It's the leading threat to human health globally, causing more life years lost than any other factor. And today I'm joined by Dr. Christa Hasenkopf to explore why this topic deserves more attention and how better data, funding, and policy can make a real difference. Dr. Christa Hasenkopf is the director of the Clean Air Program at the Energy Policy Institute of Chicago, where she works to improve access to information and tools that help improve air quality. She co-founded and was the CEO of OpenAQ, the world's largest open air quality data platform. And she has held roles at the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development. She holds a PhD in atmospheric and oceanic sciences from the University of Colorado. Christa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited for the conversation.
Me too. And I'm very excited to talk about this topic because I think it doesn't get enough attention like in the EU or the United States, where it's mostly about climate change. But I think air pollution is just a really important problem. So I'm very happy to talk about this. And maybe just to start off with, could you maybe just give an overview of how does the harm arise from air pollution and like how are people impacted? Because I think there's some statistics that might really surprise people here in terms of like what the impact is globally.
Yeah, globally, we estimate with research we've done at EPIC that currently people are losing about 2 years of life expectancy due to air pollution. And really just one specific type of air pollution, PM 2.5, which is essentially smoke. And that's more than HIV, AIDS, malaria combined. And so it's actually estimated by the global burden of disease to have air pollution is estimated to have the largest impact in terms of mortality and morbidity combined on a negative impact on public health, which is, I think, astounding. And then, depending where you look across the world, it can be the number one driver of mortality, especially in countries in Asia and Africa. And to your question of like how, essentially, I think we all know it doesn't feel good to breathe in pollution, and we know it doesn't feel good on our lungs, and it can cause respiratory issues and long-term things like lung cancer. But something that's a little bit harder to realize without actually having research is that essentially air pollution, especially PM 2.5 particles, these very tiny particles, you breathe them in, they get throughout your entire body, and every single organ can be affected, but it can cause heart attacks, strokes, COPD, and really it exacerbates any other issue in your body as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so if you said it, it's like more life years lost globally than HIV and malaria combined. And I think it even more than drinking?
It is. And malnutrition, and I believe maternal and child health, it's comparable to smoking.
That's crazy. So how did you get interested in the topic of air pollution?
I first became interested as I was finishing up my PhD, and I was working on issues outside of our planet in our solar system, and doing research that, frankly, couldn't quite see the value directly to human beings on this planet. And so I started asking myself, what could I do with my atmospheric science degree to have more of a direct impact on people? And I would attend all of these different seminars outside of my field at University of Colorado, and happened to sit in on this ecologist who was talking about, honestly, things I don't remember at this point, 15-ish years ago. But I do remember him showing this picture while he was traveling through Mongolia. He was in the capital city, just transiting through, and he happened to show a picture from his hotel room for some reason. And there was a ton of black smoke. And I was like, I had no idea Mongolia, which when I think of Mongolia, I think of like, open steppe, having a lot of pollution. And so talked to him a little bit about it afterwards. He's like, yes, the capital city has so much pollution. And so then I looked into it, and it has a huge air pollution problem. There had been hardly any studies about it. The equipment that one would use to do something to get like a basic characterization was essentially the equipment I'd used during my PhD to do this very different research. And I thought, wow, I can I can actually do something useful with my skill set. Long story short, went to Mongolia for 2 years, did a very basic study with colleagues at the National University of Mongolia to understand and characterize the pollution there. While doing that, realized something even more simple was needed, which was basic real-time air quality information on a daily basis, so people and policy could have a better sense of the air pollution problem there. And also, I will say, like, just living there and tasting the pollution on a daily basis, it just really drove home the air pollution as an issue, and just how, to your point earlier, how appreciated the issue is globally, yet what a big impact it has on lives. So that was sort of my entryway into the air pollution world.
How then did you take the step to founding this Open AQ? Because you co-founded and then led this organization. Like, how did that then come about?
Yeah. It started, the seed of the idea came from that work in Mongolia. And we'd actually seen the US State Department had launched at the Beijing embassies an air quality monitor that shared out air pollution. And it had this, it was around 2012, 2013, this outsized impact in terms of the attention that monitor got. And really, there was, third party app developers in Beijing who started accessing that information, putting this information in the hands of millions of Beijingers for the first time, who knew air pollution was a problem in Beijing, but it's different when you see on an hourly basis what it looks like, and so this caused a huge stir, and it was just this very, very simple project where they're measuring air quality and putting it out into the public. And so we thought, why not do that in Mongolia? It also had an outsized impact, and then realized all across the world, once I went to the State Department, that there was a lot of air pollution data, but not shared in a fully open way. So it'd be on a website somewhere, but no one could really access it. You couldn't, make graphs with it. You couldn't do analysis with it. And so it seemed like a really good idea for someone to do that. We tried for a bit to get like other larger international organizations to do that. It seemed like a natural thing. Instead, when that didn't work, we thought, well, let's build this project ourselves. And it started with just a couple countries at first, and we grew from there.
It seems like the way you're saying it is that, like in Beijing or in Mongolia, people weren't aware of just how bad the air pollution was. And then once they got some information, then they became a lot more concerned. Is that like what kind of happened?
I think very broadly, yes. But I will say, nearly everyone knew both in both places that it's a problem, like the larger issue. But I think having information that would appear and say, "Wow, this is," what would happen in the Beijing case in particular was, whoever at the State Department had programmed the information that went out to Twitter at the time, on a automatic basis. They never expected the air pollution to get above a certain level, so they kind of had a jokey uh, uh, tag for the pollution levels when it got above this apocalyptic level, what it was called in the media. It was like beyond index, and I had a very inflammatory phrase to associated with it, and that made headlines, and I think that really got people's attention. But I also think it was people having the app and having an app that pulled data like that in and saying, "Oh wow, maybe I shouldn't go outside right now." Oh wow, it's bad again like that. And then seeing it compared to various places, I think that was a big driver, and gave it some immediacy. I've seen this study, by the way. This is a bit of a non sequitur, but I've seen this study for marathon runners, and it shows like there you can actually see at the half hour and the hour marks. When people are looking at their watches, they start hurrying up, and so you have this flood of people who finish right before the half hour mark, right before the hour mark. And so I do think like having real time information changes the way we act and gives it some immediacy, than it would otherwise.
You also mentioned that it had an impact in Mongolia. Like, what happened there? So you like saw Beijing and then tried to do it there too in real time?
Yeah, in a much smaller scale. So this was a tiny effort that I did with my colleague at the National University of Mongolia. We got some funding to put up a single monitor at the university, and then people at the time in Ulaanbaatar, the capital, really liked Facebook more so than Twitter. So we shared the data out on Facebook. This was an effort. I think it was less than $10,000 for what it cost. But it caused a bit of a stir. National Geographic Mongolia began covering it. Student groups were talking about the issue with various other groups and kind of spreading the word. My Mongolian colleague got invited to the parliament to talk about the role of air pollution and data. And prior to that, there was a lot of non-data driven conversation about where air pollution came from in the city, and people would say it came from China. Now, China was thousands of kilometers away.
Yeah.
There's a big desert in between. That's not what was happening, but having that data kind of made it like one had to reckon with the reality of where pollution was coming from within the city itself, and so it sort of changed the dynamic. And I think a lot of factors contributed to this, but I do think that effort contributed as well. But the Mongolian government expanded their air quality monitoring. They made their data more open. And again opened up a lot of conversations between, say, research and university groups working on the issue with the government about, like, okay, what do we actually do, instead of broadly waving hands and blaming China.
I get the sense, like, as it comes, sometimes you talk about like the lack of information to act upon. Like, it just seems like once you have this monitor in place, people can actually measure it, and like the conversation becomes more quantitative or like more scientific. Like, it's this much, this isn't good, versus, oh, we generally know it's bad.
Absolutely. I think it gives it concreteness. I also think there's this human side of it. And, an effort we're doing now, which perhaps we'll dig into later at EPIC, is, we're supporting these groups to measure air quality and share data with the public in various countries. And in one of the countries, in a couple of the countries, actually, what we're seeing is the data is there. They're making data exist where it didn't before. They're engaging policymakers, and it's almost, in addition to the data, it's sort of this. There's a touch point. There's a trust being built between civil society and government to, like, hey, here is a go-to person or organization on air pollution. Now we can talk with them about policy. What should we do? We've never had a clean air standard before. How does that look? And so I think there's the data that sets the problem and gives some immediacy and perhaps builds some social and political will. And then I think there's also the human linkage point that is actually, I think it goes underestimated. I think it's huge for governments to say, okay, I see the data's bad. Now what do I do about it? And who can I turn to do something about? Well, here's a group that exists and I can talk to them. So that's been something we've noticed as well.
So is that then something you do as well then? Like, if they have questions about, or you say this group to turn to, do you mean an EPIC?
Mainly, I'm referring to the group that we support. So a government entity, like, for example, in Gambia, the government's been working with a group we've been supporting, a nonprofit we've been supporting. And that government group, a government entity, is now, they see that nonprofit we're supporting as sort of the go-to air pollution experts in Gambia, because they are.
Yeah.
They are legit. But otherwise, without them having, the nonprofit having launched this initially small data effort, eventually building ties with the government wouldn't have necessarily had it on their radar.
One of the things you said is, going back to the beginning, is trying to make it cheaper to measure emissions. Then you mentioned this like fund that you have to promote emissions in different countries. Like, how does it work? Because one of the statistics that I read that I was kind of shocked by is that on your side you mentioned that Europe, US, and Canada contribute just 4.2% of the world's life years lost to air pollution, yet receive 60% of philanthropic funds to fight it. Whereas, Africa receives funding equivalent to the cost of a single family home in the United States. So it seems like just a giant gap in fund distribution relative to the problem.
Yeah, the total pie, which ends up being in philanthropic dollars devoted to air pollution, is like somewhere between 60 and 70 million total. Meanwhile, important but less health harming issues like HIV/AIDS and malaria and TB have a $5 billion a year fund attached to them. And there's no such fund like that for air pollution. And so what we're doing at EPIC is nowhere near a $5 billion fund, but the flip side of there being such a resource scarcity for air pollution is that you can inject a small amount, relatively speaking, and have an outsized impact. At least that was our our working assumption for this fund. And so basically, we support organizations. They can be governments, they can be nonprofits, they can be for-profits, they can be research entities in countries where we've done an analysis to see where there's the highest opportunity for a small effort, small sustained effort that measures air pollution and uses it for some sort of national impact strategy could have the most impact. And so, like in this analysis, these are countries that have an air pollution problem. But they're countries that don't have many resources, or in terms of data or philanthropic funding flowing through them as best as we can measure, and also may not have national air quality standards. So these are not countries like India or China or the U.S., where to varying degrees have air pollution issues, obviously still, but data is not the bottleneck, for example. And so this is the places like Cameroon or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where surprisingly enough, a 50 to 100K initiative, USD per year initiative, can actually, and we're seeing this now, can actually have this national level impact.
That's really huge. Maybe then an economics question, like, is the marginal benefit of additional funding still high? Like, say if Bill Gates, which I imagine like has to be aware, or like some extent, like what if Bill Gates gets involved and says, here's another 10 million, would the marginal benefit be very high, or do you feel like you've got good coverage at the moment?
I think it'd be really high, because what we're seeing is with these groups that we're supporting at the smaller level, like this 50 to 100K USD per year-ish level, is they're sort of kickstarting stuff, say policy conversations with governments. They're getting the appetite there. But then to do major national level air pollution solutions, or refitting industrial sources of pollution, so that you have scrubbers that reduce the pollution. These are major infrastructure investments. So our hope is that we're catalyzing some of that interest, and we're also de-risking. So, as I said, many of these countries have not received either very little or zero philanthropic investment, and so I think part of that's been a fear of risk for say funding from a philanthropic perspective. And so perhaps, like, our goal is hopefully with this cohort to de-risk some of these locations, and people then invest at a higher level, because I do think that's what it'll ultimately take. Like, this is a great start. Now we need some major investment that doesn't come from Epic, but larger sources, Bill Gates, World Bank, larger donors
Exactly.
of the world.
When they're listening to this podcast, they'll be aware, and then we got to get you on their podcast so they become more aware. So thanks so much for that. Maybe then, because we keep talking about like life years lost, and at Epic you're developing the Air Quality Life Index, like a measurement of the air quality. Could you talk a little bit more about like how you measure that problem?
Yeah, so this is based on research by EPIC's director and environmental economist Michael Greenstone and colleagues, who they conducted a study in China that was quite unique circumstances that essentially let them build this relationship between PM 2.5, this one type of pollution, the most health harmful pollution, and life expectancy. We take that relationship and essentially scale it across the world. There's some caveats and estimates that go along with this, but it's a really great tool for estimating how much your life expectancy could improve if the air quality you breathe where you live met the WHO guideline, or really any guideline. Like, we have a tool online where you can adjust it to whatever guideline, whether it's a national standard or a guideline of your choice. But essentially, this is how we estimate, for example, the world is losing about 2 years of life expectancy, and also lets us say, for example, how much, in Bangladesh and much of South Asia, people are losing about 5 years of life expectancy.
5 years.
Yeah. And in Delhi, specifically at a finer geospatial resolution, we're losing even more years of life expectancy. So it allows us to do comparisons across the world. And what we do to, in addition to that relationship I mentioned, what we do to estimate this is we also use satellite-derived air pollution data that allows us to have global coverage. If we were using, individual monitors, there's not coverage everywhere. But the great thing about satellite-derived information is you get an estimate across the whole.
Exactly. So Michael did the study, and then you like extrapolated to other regions based on the relationship he found there.
That's right.
When I hear those numbers, I'm like, I didn't even like 5 years is just so much. And because to meet like the climate goals that we have of like 1.5 Celsius, and then like we would want China and India also to contribute towards meeting that. But at the same time, like they're losing 5 years currently due to air pollution. So in some sense, it seems to me like the bigger priority there is to tackle the air pollution, and then as a co-benefit, like we'll reduce the CO2 emissions. And that's, I think, why in some sense tackling air pollution is also tackling climate change. Would you kind of agree with that? Or
No, I do agree with that. I think of air pollution as the other side of the coin for climate change. There's some edge cases where this isn't quite true, but by and large, if you when you're having a plan to, whether it's for climate change or air pollution, if you just consider the two, like you're going to get double the win. And I will say, for a lot of the global South, air pollution in terms of immediate economic impact, it's going to be much larger than climate change, very roughly speaking.
yeah,
Um, for sure. We're losing about, by the way, like 5%. I think it's around 5% of global GDP to um, air pollution per year, which I think is a giant portion. And then that's very disproportionately towards the global South, because as you mentioned, about 96% of that health burden from air pollution, specifically PM2.5, is felt not in the global North, but in Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
I have a question then. Like when I hear these numbers, I'm like, man, it's like a lot of life years lost. But then I think the one case where I've seen it is like China did this war on air pollution. Like it started with this Beijing monitoring by the US Embassy. People became very aware of the problem. And then China's, I think, prime minister like declared a war on air pollution. And since then, China's air pollution has been going down substantially. So I feel like that's like a big win in terms of air pollution. I was wondering, do you see that happening soon for like India and Bangladesh and Indonesia, like these other countries that haven't quite gotten to that stage? Like, I would imagine they get to a similar point in time where at some point they're like, now we're tackling this. Because for now, China's the single-handedly the cause of like this air pollution going down globally.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It is, and it's been stunning. About 40% reduction in the past 10ish years, which, when we compare that to, say, for example, the U.S.'s progression, that's been much faster, and shows what can happen in terms of how they did it. To me, I mean, it's a perfect example of uh, air pollution. We know how, like technically, we all do know how to solve the issue. It comes down to social and political will. So at that moment in 2013, there was, an uproar, I guess, of political and social will, and it resulted in that declaring war on air pollution. It also meant that the government put forward a lot of resources monetarily to do it, and also political will to enforce policies that were quite strict. So moving certain industries outside of cities, or placing them strategically where they're not necessarily downwind of the city and a population. It meant closing down certain coal burning factories. It meant pretty stringent policies that they then had enforcement mechanisms to see through. And it also meant a huge expansion of their monitoring to make sure this was like what they were doing actually working. It also meant, with that monitoring, the data was more open, and so people could actually see what was happening. Now, whether this can happen in other places, I think some form of this is almost inevitable in most places. It's just a matter of when. Of course, China operates at a different scale and speed than almost any other nation, but I do think there's lessons, and I think there's lessons for smaller countries. So I mentioned in Gambia, where we're seeing this huge impact. Certain countries can move very fast. A country like China can. Actually, a lot of small countries can too, where there can be a lot of political and social will that builds up very quickly. Now, resources can be an issue at the scale that China deployed them on. So I think this also is a question of whether the world and its finance mechanisms and philanthropy can act on it. But again, like from the example we're seeing in Gambia, I would not be surprised if Gambia in 5 years has cut their pollution by 25 to 50%, given what I'm seeing going on there. And so I think it's a question of of where to target, where to most strategically target the funds that do exist, and how to build more funds in the system. Now, a country like India, that's harder. Data's not the bottleneck there. I think what will solve India's air pollution problems is going to be internal to India. Like, I don't think the outside world's going to change that.
Which then like brings us to a different topic, which is the Energy Policy Institute of Chicago has been involved with India in trying to combat air pollution. So one of the topics on your side is clean air markets, which to economists sounds like, that sounds like the right thing to do. Let's have markets for clean air. So I mean, I have called the podcast Climate Economics because I'm naturally focused towards those solutions. So could you maybe then talk to what's going on with clean air markets in India and like how that's developing? Because I think it's also a really cool story.
So in 2019, U Chicago partnered with a couple other groups, including JPAL, Yale, and then government officials in Gujarat, India, to launch this first PM 2.5 emission trading scheme. And this is based on other emission trading schemes that have worked elsewhere in the U.S. And basically, they allowed plants to buy and sell permits for PM emissions to stay within a fixed limits, and then each plant could decide how much they could pollute, and then they could sell. If they didn't pollute too much, they could sell unused permits. Very, very basic concept there of an emission trading scheme. But the thing is, this has been extremely successful. They've seen a 20 to 30% reduction in air pollution by implementing this. So it's been extremely successful. And I think an exciting question now for EPIC is how and where this scales next. Where does it make the most sense to scale it, whether it's in India or elsewhere, and where can it be most effective? So I think it's been an incredible thing to watch that unfurl at EPIC.
No, exactly. And I get the sense that Gujarat itself is very happy with the results, and they're like, let's continue this work on this, which is really nice because, as an economist, during my PhD, it's more like, oh, here's a model of the world and it works great, but then to do it in practice is a whole different thing. So I think that's really cool. I should mention there is a video that is created on, I think, this clean air market by EPIC, which I will post also in the notes to the podcast. I think it's like an 8-minute thing. I think it's quite well done. So I recommend people checking it out just to get a better sense of what went on there. And also just, I think there was some cool research that they did too of like, how can we make sure that people report truthfully? There was all these other stuff. So I think it's a really cool development. I kind of get the sense that there's actually a lot of really good things being developed at the moment. So do you feel optimistic about this? Or do you of course it should always go faster, but I mean, there's still a lot to be done, but is it like going fast enough?
I'm definitely optimistic. I don't think we're moving fast enough or that there's enough resources in the space. But, when it comes to our fund, I'm very optimistic about what we're doing with our fund by definition. But I've even been shocked at how fast things have progressed because so we've been doing the fund we'll hit our 1-year mark in July, and we've had a couple proto awards a little bit before that. But we have 2 groups, for example, that are already working. Like they've gone from somehow the data generation piece to sharing the data, to engaging the governments, to working with the governments to draft national air quality standards. I thought that would take a few years, not at this pace. And I think it goes to show just how a little bit of injection in for example, the African continent. So I believe the number is 238,000 a year. That cost of the less than the cost of a house in the U.S. That's invested on the African continent in terms of total global philanthropy devoted to air pollution. So that's crazy, I think. And so for our fund in its first year, and it's a modest fund, it's not a big fund, we've been able to almost 5x that in terms of
Mhm.
investment. And so I'm very optimistic in the sense if we can, if we as a broader air quality community can simply get more attention to the issue, because I do think in this case attention can translate into resources. We have a really high potential for addressing air pollution in a lot of places that are going under the radar in the next 5 years, even.
So I'm fully on board, and I'm in Europe now, and I'm just thinking to get more funding because the EU is now, they're looking at these credit offsets to hit the climate goals. But in some sense, these investments in measurement for air pollution are a way to directly tackle climate change in a way that much be maybe much more effective, or like accelerating the pace much more. Because sometimes with these offsets, it's like, well, you're investing in the thing that otherwise would have happened. But like with these air quality data, it seems like it might not come about very fast, or you can accelerate it at least a lot more with some investment. Because it's just such a good way to also reduce like CO2 emissions while tackling the thing they really care about, which is the air pollution.
Yeah, and build like the actual capacity to do any of that stuff, right, in the country with people in the country, not from outside, which I think matters.
Okay, then I so we it's yeah, I mean, I get coherent now, but I'm just so shocked that there's like not more attention to this from philanthropies, or like I'm wondering why Bill Gates hasn't invested like more money into this. I think that's like my big question. Like, why why do you have any idea? Like,
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think it's a really good question to ask, and I don't think there is an adequate answer. But I think some of the reasons that people haven't in the past is unlike, say, a disease, you can't just do it like measure shots in arms, and it takes a bit more. It's a bit more complicated, and there's also a bit of a removal between, say, a philanthropist and the actual outcome. You have to take a bit of a leap in faith that a community, a government that you can't fully control will have to do that, and so it's a little less direct and a little less measurable for that reason. And I do think that's partly why. Um, I think air pollution also is an issue in general, given its invisibility uh, by nature of it. In terms of you don't necessarily see air pollution that harms you. You can when it's really bad. You can't necessarily see the impact it's causing you. You don't die of air pollution disease. I think these things don't help it either. Um, but I think we're becoming smart enough in aggregate. I'd like to think that like the case has been built, and hopefully we will turn a corner. And it's a real opportunity for the right philanthropists or the right development agencies to see what they could accomplish, what good they could do in the world on one of on the world's largest burden on human health. So that keeps me super hopeful about it.
that's great. If those philanthropists might be listening to this podcast, where could they reach you, or like where can they find more about you and the work you're doing?
The best place would be the Epic Air Quality Fund website, which will come up if you Google Epic AQ Fund or Epic Air Quality Fund at University of Chicago. And we have a bunch of information there, a map of where current awardees are, but also where we think the largest opportunities remain across the world that are not yet supported.
Sounds great. And are you on social media? Can people follow you there?
I'm on LinkedIn. Epic is on Twitter and LinkedIn, and it's a great place to follow our work.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much. I found this really helpful, and I hope people come away with it's a really big challenge. It should just get more attention, and so hopefully this podcast can contribute a little bit to that. So, thank you so much. That's it for this episode. Thank you very much for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation, feel free to subscribe, share it with a friend, or check the show notes for more information. You can contact me on arvid.viana.ce@gmail.com. That is also in the show notes. And I will see you in another episode. Have a great day.